Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are jumping into the FTL drive, but not for the physics of it. We're heading straight into the ethical core of the 2004 Battlestar Galactica.
Right. It gets labeled as just, intense survival sci-fi, but really, when you dig into the sources, BSG is this massive 70-hour humanist thought experiment.
70 hours, yeah. It uses that whole near-extinction scenario to basically strip everything away, doesn't it?
Exactly. Leaves you with just the messy, complicated, often pretty ugly truth about being human.
Okay, let's unpack that. Our mission for this deep dive is figuring out how this show became what the sources call a site of critical cultural production.
Meaning it tackles huge moral and political issues, torture, democracy under threat, genocide even, but crucially, it doesn't hand you the answers on a plate.
It actively tries for this value-free judgment. That's the term the sources use.
Yeah, and the central conflict we're looking at today, based on the material, is that tension. Being human versus being humane.
Does just being biologically human automatically make you ethical?
And what happens when the supposed machine shows more compassion than the people who built it? It's a core question.
So we've got two main sources informing this discussion. First, there's a philosophical analysis digging into the humanist themes, the constant ethical dilemmas, the sort of theological conflicts.
And second, which is really fascinating, an academic study based on actual interviews with the creators, writers, actors, producers. It looks at how they tried to encode meaning.
And the challenges they hit, trying to be political while also maybe trying to seem neutral.
Exactly. That gap between what they intended and how people received it, that's where a lot of the interesting stuff happens. It's like looking at the blueprints, not just the finished building.
Right. So how did a show about, let's face it, robots and spaceships end up being one of the most relevant, hard-hitting explorations of our modern ethical messes? Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really get BSG, you have to start with the showrunner, Ron Moore, and his initial plan, his show Bible. He had this very specific mission.
It wasn't just, let's remake an old show. He was actively picking a fight with the genre, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Especially the kind of cleaner, more optimistic sci-fi that came before, like maybe Star Trek. The Next Generation, which he actually worked on, he wanted to challenge that whole aesthetic.
He wanted to get away from neat moral lessons wrapped up in 45 minutes.
Precisely. He called it naturalistic science fiction. That was the goal. Move away from what he saw as heightened characters and shiny, unrealistic sets.
He wanted grit. Realism.
Yeah.
Even in space.
Yeah. Characters driven by jealousy, fear, weakness. Actual human stuff, not just philosophical stand-ins.
And the look of the show reflects that, right? The ships are banged up, the lighting's harsh.
Totally. It feels lived in, worn down. They're dealing with trauma, lack of resources, political backstabbing, things that feel very, very familiar. More explicitly said, it should be an allegory for our own society.
And the timing, coming out right after 9/11, that's impossible to ignore. That context hangs over everything.
It really does. The paranoia, the fear, the political climate, it's all baked in. So they were trying to encode these pretty pointed messages through that allegory.
So what was the core philosophy behind that? How do they approach truth and judgment in the writing?
The big thing was rejecting easy answers. Moore always said the show worked best when it asks questions and doesn't try to give you what the answers are.
Easier said than done over multiple seasons, I bet.
For sure. The writers, people like Jane Espenson, Bradley Thompson, they consciously aimed for stories where characters make, quote, bad decisions for good reasons or good decisions for bad reasons.
That's the heart of value-free judgment in storytelling, isn't it? No clear good guys or bad guys.
Yeah.
It just refuses to give the audience that easy moral takeaway.
Exactly. But like you said, it's tough. Viewers often want that closure, that sense of who is right.
So how did they manage it?
They relied on the audience to argue about it. They wanted people debating online, talking about whether Roslin was right to steal an election or if Adama's coup was justified. The ambiguity was the point, not a bug.
And they could get away with asking these really tough, potentially controversial questions because of the setting itself, that thick metaphor idea.
Yeah, Jane Espenson's term. The sci-fi elements, the Cylons, the spaceships, all the cool visuals act like a buffer, a thick metaphor.
It lets them be more direct, maybe more heavy-handed with the politics, because the audience is partly distracted by the genre stuff.
That's the idea. If the show depicts things like, say, widespread torture by a secret committee or suspending democracy,
the viewer can kind of distance themselves. Oh, that's not us. That's those guys in space fighting robots.
Exactly. Bradley Thompson, one of the writers, pretty much said that. The sci-fi blanket lets them tackle difficult things by saying, it's not really us, it's these people. But then he immediately added, of course it is us.
That distance creates the space for critique.
Right. It allowed them to hold up a mirror to some really dark aspects of the post-9/11 world without sounding like they were just preaching. It's a clever narrative strategy.
Embedding complex, critical commentary inside a genre, often known more for spectacle. Okay, that makes sense. So this whole setup, this naturalistic sci-fi with its thick metaphor, leads us right into the show's biggest humanist question. It's not just about politics. It's asking something more fundamental.
Yeah, it forces you to confront what actually is a human. And maybe more importantly, where do you draw the line for personhood?
And the Cylons are the key to unlocking that question.
Absolutely. Moore and his team made a very conscious choice not to make them just evil robots. They depicted them as complex, as sentient.
They feel things, right? Love, pain, faith.
Mm-hmm.
They even make art.
They really do. They have deep emotional bonds, spiritual beliefs, a desire for purpose. Sometimes, frankly, they seem more human or at least more consistently ethical than the actual humans.
You think of characters like Caprica 6 and her intense, almost religious connection to Baltar.
Or the Cylon sympathizers who argue for peace and end up making huge sacrifices based on compassion. The show constantly throws that contrast in your face.
So you can't just write off the enemy as pure evil.
Nope. The conflict is between two species, one organic, one synthetic, and both are deeply flawed, morally compromised.
Which then shines a light on how the humans cope with that uncomfortable reality by dehumanizing them, calling them toasters.
Right. And the sources are clear. That wasn't just random sci-fi slang. It was meant as a deliberate psychological move.
Just like in real-world conflicts. Right?
Yeah.
Calling the enemy vermin or machines, it makes it easier to
justify cruelty. If you can convince yourself the enemy isn't really a person, just an object, a toaster, then suddenly violence becomes much easier to accept, even when that toaster is shown praying or mourning.
The show forces you to ask, how do we justify hurting another being that seems to feel and think?
By stripping them of their personhood first. It's the essential prerequisite for so much horror, historically speaking.
And this fictional struggle connects directly to real-world debates we're having now about AI, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. BSG takes that core question, what does it take for a creation to deserve rights, consciousness, suffering, love, and pushes it to the absolute extreme.
If something can think and feel, does it automatically get rights, regardless of how it was made?
That's the dilemma. And the show relentlessly demonstrates that just being biologically human is zero guarantee of acting humanely. Often, the humans, driven by fear and prejudice, are far less humane than the Cylons searching for meaning.
It's that value-free judgment again. It puts characters like Adama and Roslin, and by extension, us, the viewers, in this incredibly uncomfortable spot of having to define life and moral obligation without any easy answers.
Okay, so if we've wrestled with defining personhood, the next step is how you govern it, or how you suppress it when you're pushed to the absolute limit. The sources really frame the show as this kind of moral pressure cooker.
Yeah, it just relentlessly critiques how humans, or maybe humanity in general, react under extreme stress. Those political instincts aren't always pretty.
Not at all. And this is where those post-9/11 parallels become really, really obvious. They're not subtle anymore.
They're using that thick metaphor shield to hit pretty hard.
Definitely. Think about the critique of democracy itself. After the Cylon attack, you watch President Roslin, who's supposed to be the symbol of civilian rule. She suspends democratic processes, institutes martial law, even rigs an election to keep power.
And that forces you, the audience, to ask those really tough questions about your own values, right? Like, how much freedom do you trade for security?
Exactly. When does the fight to preserve your ideals actually destroy them? Where's that line?
And it gets even darker with the whole institutionalization of cruelty, the committee.
Right. This secret group within the military and government using torture, holding people without trial. It directly mirrors the debates around Guantanamo Bay, enhanced interrogation, all that stuff that was happening when the show aired.
And the show doesn't paint torture as just a grim necessity either. It shows the cost, the way it corrupts people. Characters like Callie, even Baltar gets involved.
It shows how ordinary people can become part of state-sanctioned cruelty when fear dominates. And crucially, there's no easy out. Maybe the torture does get information that saves lives.
But the moral damage is done. It's permanent.
Yeah. It suggests the biggest threat might not even be the Cylons, but our own willingness to sacrifice principles for safety, our tendency towards prejudice.
And often leading the charge isn't some grand evil mastermind, but someone like Gaius Balter. The show's take on the banality of evil.
He's such a perfect example. He's not driven by some evil philosophy. He's just weak, vain, cowardly, utterly self-absorbed.
But his very ordinary failings lead directly to the deaths of billions.
It's terrifyingly relatable in a way. It shows how catastrophic consequences can flow from simple selfishness, especially when that person ends up in a position of power, which he does multiple times. First as a Cylon pawn, then president, then a religious figure.
It suggests the biggest danger might just be the incompetent, self-serving person making decisions under pressure.
And the show keeps throwing these impossible choices at the characters and at us. Like you said, one trolley problem after another. The airlock becomes this recurring stage for moral horror.
Deontological ethics duty to protect every single life versus utilitarianism, the greater good.
Think about executing the Cylon collaborator. Definitely a threat, but also a person. Airlocking one to save the many.
Or even worse, maybe, the decision to just abandon civilian ships. Thousands of people left behind to save the main fleet.
Logically, you can argue for it. Save the 40,000 who can maybe restart humanity, sacrifice the 5,000, slowing them down. Utilitarianism 101.
But the show never lets you feel comfortable with that math. You see the faces, you feel Adama's agony making that call.
That's the value-free judgment again. It shows you the cold calculation and the human horror side by side, no filter.
And this refusal to simplify extends even to things like terrorism, doesn't it? They deliberately blurred the lines.
Oh, massively. Look at the new Caprica storyline, when the humans are under Cylon occupation and form a resistance.
Right, and they have a human character, one we know and maybe sympathize with.
Plant a suicide bomb. In a civilian area, a coffee shop where Cylon engineers hang out. Not a military target.
And making it a human doing that flips the usual script entirely. Why was that specific framing so important?
According to writer David Weddle, the goal was just to examine the issues from odd angles. Avoid judgment. Put the horrific act in the hands of a good guy, and suddenly the audience has to grapple with it. Is it resistance? Is it murder?
They wanted people arguing about it.
Exactly. They provide the brutal scenario, but they withhold the verdict. You have to decide for yourself.
Okay, so this intense focus on value-free judgment, on forcing the audience to grapple with ambiguity. What happens when they apply that to big cultural issues, like gender, race, faith?
Well, that's where things get really complex and where, according to the sources, the creators sometimes ran into their own limitations or blind spots.
They started with gender, a pretty progressive idea, right?
Yeah.
Trying to create a gender-neutral world.
Yeah, Ron Moore's goal was a society where things like power, ambition, military skill, they weren't tied to gender stereotypes at all. The most famous example, obviously, was making Starbuck female.
Which caused a huge uproar among some fans of the original series.
Oh, yeah. Intense backlash. The sources mention Moore being called nasty names online, female characters getting labeled butch, the original Starbuck actor writing that Lost in Castration essay. It really highlights how radical that change felt at the time.
But the result on screen was pretty groundbreaking for the era. You had President Roslin and Commander Adama, arguably the two most powerful people in the fleet, both women.
And presented as capable leaders, full stop. Their gender wasn't the defining trait. Plus, the casual normalization of same-sex relationships, like Admiral Kane and Gina, or Gaeta and his partner, no big, very special episode, just part of life.
That normalization seems like a definite success, but did the gender neutrality always land perfectly? The sources mentioned some critiques from within the production.
Right. Grace Park, who played Sharon, pointed out something interesting. She felt the show still operated under a kind of agromasculinity, meaning that even though women held power, they often had to achieve it by conforming to a very traditionally masculine, aggressive, militaristic way of being. Roslin had to be tough. Starbuck was defined by combat.
Less room for strength expressed in other ways, non-violent ways, maybe?
That seemed to be her point. It avoided overt patriarchy, perhaps, but maybe ended up valuing only one specific type of strength, which both men and women had to adopt.
Interesting. And Mary McDonnell, who played Roslyn, apparently had to push back sometimes.
Yeah, she mentioned needing to advocate for her character's nuances with the mostly male writing team, suggesting that even with good intentions, some patriarchal assumptions might have needed policing.
Okay, let's shift to race. This seems like maybe the trickiest area for that value-free ideal. They had a diverse cast.
Very diverse for the time. Korean, South African, Latino actors in major roles, and the writer's stated goal was colorblindness.
Meaning race as we understand it on Earth, just. didn't exist in their universe. Conflicts were based on which colony you were from, not skin color.
That was the intention. Writers like Thompson and Weddell argued this let them explore prejudice more clearly without the specific historical baggage tied to Earth-based ethnicities. They explicitly said, race is not a factor in Galactica.
Okay, so that's the writers encoding. But did the actors see it that way, the people actually embodying these roles?
That's where you see a split. The writers aimed for neutrality, but some actors felt their very presence was a statement. Tom O'Bennickett, for instance, saw playing Hilo as inherently challenging stereotypes just by being a complex character played by a person of mixed heritage. They saw it as critical encoding, regardless of the writer's colorblind intentions.
So the meaning being made wasn't totally controlled by the writers? The actors and the audience bring their own context.
Exactly, which leads to the academic critique about the limits of colorblindness. Lisa Nakamura's analysis of Grace Park's character, Sharon.
What was the specific point there?
It focused on a scene where Sharon, being a Cylon, literally plugs a cable into her arm to interface with the ship's computer. Nakamura argued that, intended or not, this image, the Asian actress physically merging with the technology, could unintentionally reinforce existing stereotypes about Asians and tech proficiency.
Wow, that's subtle. But I can see it. Even if the writers meant she is a Cylon doing Cylon things, the visual lands differently because of real-world associations.
Precisely. It shows the gap between encoding, we don't see race, and decoding, but we live in a world where race does mean things, and this image connects to those meanings.
And how did the writers react to that kind of critique?
According to the sources, they pushed back pretty hard. Weddell and Espenson rejected the idea of overlaying the actor's race onto the character's fictional Cylon actions. They stuck to their guns about the colorblind vision.
So that resistance itself is interesting. It shows just how committed they were to that ideal of neutrality, even when faced with arguments about how it might actually function in the real world. It seems race was where that value-free goal was maybe hardest to achieve cleanly.
So we've seen how BSG uses this intense pressure cooker environment to force engagement with ethics, politics, culture. Let's try to tie some threads together by looking at faith.
Right, because the contrast between human faith and Cylon faith is huge throughout the series.
It really is. The humans generally have this sort of messy, pragmatic, polytheistic system, lots of gods, ancient myths, whereas the Cylons have this very fervent, unified, monotheistic belief.
And that Cylon certainty, that absolute belief in their one true God, is what they use to justify, well, genocide.
Exactly. The show becomes this powerful warning about the dangers of absolute, zealous certainty versus maybe a more humble, questioning approach to the big unknowns.
And Laura Roslin embodies that human approach, doesn't she? She's not dogmatic.
Not at all. She uses the sacred scrolls, the prophecies, but more as cultural tools for hope, for guidance, maybe even manipulation sometimes. But her own faith seems constantly tested, evolving. It's religion as a source of myth and comfort, not rigid, literal truth.
Which brings us, I guess, to the ending, the series finale, often kind of slammed as just, oh, God did it.
Yeah, that's the simplistic take. But if you look at it through this humanist and philosophical lens the sources provide, you can read it very differently.
The idea isn't a literal interventionist God stepping in.
No, the interpretation suggested by the analysis is that God, in the finale, functions more as a metaphor.
A metaphor for what?
For the emergent power of consciousness itself, maybe, both human and Cylon. For love, for connection, for the potential for life and meaning to arise even out of chaos. That music of the spheres idea that pops up, the stuff science can't quite explain yet.
So it's about the inherent potential within the characters, within life itself, to find a way to choose connection, to choose the humane path.
That's a much more humanist reading, yeah. It fits better with the show's overall focus on difficult choices and internal struggles.
Okay, that reframes the ending quite a bit. And it kind of validates what the creators were trying to do all along, using sci-fi as distance.
To ask the hardest questions without giving easy answers. Right up to the very end, they refuse that moral cheat sheet. They force you to decide what it means to be human, and more importantly, humane, under impossible circumstances.
The critique isn't softened, it's just.
Yeah.
The judgment is left out. The audience has to fill that space.
And that ongoing tension, that need for the audience to complete the moral equation, that's really the show's legacy.
Which brings us to a final thought. Given what we discussed about race, about how aiming for colorblindness maybe didn't entirely escape real-world stereotypes.
The critique from Nakamura, the actors' perspectives.
Right. It makes you wonder, If a piece of art, a piece of cultural critique, aims to be universal, aims for that value-free stance, can it ever truly separate its fictional world from the actual social, racial, historical context of the audience watching it?
That's the big question, isn't it? The creators might intend for a value-free judgment, a clean slate, but the audience always brings their history, their context, to the table when they decode that art. Can you ever truly escape that?
A really provocative challenge to think about. We definitely encourage you to maybe rewatch Battlestar Galactica or watch it for the first time, keeping these ideas in mind. Decide for yourself who managed to be human and who managed to be humane.
Keep questioning the stories you engage with. It's always worth doing.
So say we all.